Thanks so much for joining us this morning. My name is Bree Turner. I work on the Habitat Strategic Initiative team as the Marine Vegetation Implementation Strategy Lead. I'm absolutely thrilled to be a moderator for this session. Love the research, all about that. And I'm joined today with Nick, who is also on the HSIL team. He's supporting the timekeeping aspect, so you'll see him with his cards later on. And this is going to be fun. We've got some combination of shorter presentations. It'll be 5 minutes. We'll kind of be blazing through those. So we don't have any time for questions for those. Then we'll have a couple longer presentations towards the end, kind of depending on how those go. We may have time for one or two questions for those, but we hope to have at the very end time for combined questions, seeing how we're doing on time. And so if you could hold or write those questions down, and we'll hopefully get to them by the end. We do plan to be out of here at 12:25, going on down to lunch. I'll mention this again at the end, but really thrilled to be able to offer some lunch today. And we do have folks with a variety of dietary needs. And so what we're going to do, lunch is going to be back down in the grand hall. There's going to be a room in the back, and on the sides of that room, there will be folks who have requested special diet requests, like vegan or vegetarian or certain allergies. We ask that if you do not have those restrictions in your diet, to eat from the food in the middle of the room. So stay away from the sides if you don't need it. It will make sense when you go down there. Let's see. Without that anymore, I think that's all the logistics. So I'll kind of dive in. So for the strategic implementation strategies, one of the main goals of the implementation strategies is to gather uncertainties around and really capture what are those research needs that we have that will really accelerate and enable habitat recovery and restoration. And a big part of kind of building those implementation strategies is really pulling those research needs together, and something that's been definitely top of mind for the marine vegetation implementation over the last year. And since 2016, really from the beginning of the Habitat Strategic Initiative, we have been supporting research and monitoring. And spanning both of our cooperative agreements with EPA, it's been a major priority. And in fact, roughly a quarter of the work that HSIL has funded has really been directly tied to research and monitoring. And so really kind of advancing and gathering and answering these important questions we have to accelerate that recovery. And during this session, we're going to be hearing 6 kind of current projects that we're funding that really are going to take us from the white caps all the way up the watershed and then back down again. So it's going to be a ride. I'm looking forward to hearing more about these sessions myself. And we're going to really move through these projects through diverse approaches to fill these key information barriers and advancing recovery. So we're going to start out with David Timbach, and he's going to come up with the project is with WDFW.
Good morning, everybody. I'm David Trimbuck, and I'm the conservation social scientist with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, a position you probably never heard of, but it's an exciting job. It's really fun. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that we're working on that is entitled Enhancing Kelp Protection and Restoration Through Community-Based Social Science Research. It involves a lot of awesome partners, as you can see here, including Rachel School, who is here from DNR. So we have DFW, DNR, Cascadia Consulting Group, the Asia Pacific Cultural Center, Northwest Straits Commission, and other partners, including the Hakai Institute in British Columbia. Let's see. The purpose of our project is to address a major knowledge gap in kelp science, and that is the lack of social scientific knowledge and research. And we're really focused on trying to identify and tease out the human dimensions of kelp in Puget Sound. And we're by human dimensions, we're talking about local ecological knowledge, but also climate change and environmental justice considerations. So objectives for this project include enhancing the knowledge of human dimensions of kelp. You might be asking, what does that even mean? Because it can mean all sorts of things. So for the purpose of our project, we're really focused on human kelp interactions. So like, how are humans actually interacting with kelp, the full spectrum? We want to essentially create a human kelp interaction typology. We're also interested in the kelp types that people are interacting with. We know bull kelp's really important, but what other types of kelp are people actually engaging with, and what does that look like? We're also interested in teasing out more information about kelp stressors from a human perspective. What are humans who are out there interacting with kelp seeing over time? What are their observations? We're also interested in more directly connecting vital signs. So if you're familiar with the vital sign world, we're trying to connect the marine beaches, marine vegetation vital sign with the human well-being vital sign. So like, how does kelp actually contribute to people's health and well-being in Puget Sound? And a big part of our project is also building new community relationships. Someone mentioned earlier, like, how do we get people who aren't in the room to participate in processes that impact them? So how do we actually engage Asian American harvesters who are a key harvesting population in Washington, but they're not really participating in any decision making associated with kelp? I'm gonna use this. And some key kind of like outputs we're seeking is to enhance outreach communications and engagement around kelp, including at DNR and DFW. And we really want those to be multilingual, community-tailored content. So right now we're about to launch a Korean language website about kelp at DFW. That's never happened. So how did we get here? One big issue is that there's just this major knowledge gap. I actually have a research assistant who's working on this project. They're doing literature syntheses. We don't really have a lot of social science literature on kelp, both locally and globally. There is some emerging literature coming from British Columbia and Australia, and we've actually been in contact with those researchers, so we're trying to learn from each other. But other than that, there's not a whole lot. And Puget Sound-wise, there have been a few minor exceptions. A lot of that was funded by the EPA in the late 90s, but there hasn't really been a lot of other research. And then additionally, this project actually directly builds upon work that I previously did with the Asia Pacific Cultural Center, looking at how does Puget Sound's natural environment actually impact the lives and livelihoods of Asian Americans in Puget Sound. And through that work, we actually found that kelp was a commonly harvestable food among Korean Americans specifically. So who are we going to engage as part of this work? Well, we're really like mostly interested in those groups that have this high intensity and frequency of interactions with kelp. They have that knowledge, they have that experience, they have maybe identities or memories associated with kelp, and we really want to learn from them. So that includes people in the monitoring restoration world, the harvesting world, commercial industry, and we're also interested, obviously, in the Asian American harvesting community. But because this is a public resource, we're a public agency, we're also interested in who else is interacting with kelp, like regardless of experience, right? So we're actually going to be engaging the general public. So how are we going to be doing this? We're doing this through community-based participatory research, which is a really specific type of social science that looks at communities not as subjects, but as partners. And so we're going to be using a whole bunch of tools to do this. And what are we going to be asking? These are the actual finalized questions that we're going to be asking people through those tools. I'm not going to go into detail, but what's next? So right now our research questions are under Institutional Review Board review, which is a research ethics review process. We're going to be translating them next. We're going to be hosting 8 workshops this year. We actually just applied for some additional funding to try to expand our research into British Columbia. And we're going to be presenting this summer and lots of fun products coming out next year. So thank you.
Thank you. So quick, so much fun. All right. We're next up, we're going to have Wendell from DFW.
Great, thanks, Bree. I'm a shore ecology research scientist in the habitat program at WDFW, and we're about halfway through our project, so no data, just kind of a brief overview today on evaluating eelgrass stressors to enhance conservation management in Puget Sound. So first thing to think about here is how do we do that? It's through collaboration. It's really an honor today to be the one person talking about this project that involves so many. Our core project team includes myself and others at DFW, DNR Aquatic Resources, University of Washington Friday Harbor Labs, San Juan County Department of Environmental Stewardship, um, and a nonprofit, Lighthawk, which is very cool if you don't know about them. They pair volunteer pilots with conservation projects around the world. So they help us with the aerial data collection. So working in partnership with the San Juan Island Conservation District, Samish Indian Nation, and Friends of the San Juans. All right, so how did we get here? So as many of you are probably aware, there was some concerning eelgrass population trends in Puget Sound. You may be familiar with Bart's most recent report on this subject, but some big take-home messages is that at the Puget Sound-wide scale, abundance is stable over many years. However, about 21% of monitored sites show long-term decline. And these declining sites occur throughout Puget Sound, but are concentrated in a few areas, including the San Juan Islands. So the main goal of our work is to characterize and compare the relative strength of eelgrass stressors to inform conservation, restoration, and management. So stressors to eelgrass are really well studied and well known around the world and in Washington. And this work is really foundational for our work here. However, a lot of those studies tend to focus on a single stressor or a small handful of stressors at a time. And we're in a point in the sort of the grand arc of eelgrass stressor research to start thinking about stressors in combination and the relative effects of those. So this is where our project comes in. And so a strength of our work is that we are currently collecting lots of different stressor data at the same time from a variety of sites in the San Juans. So on the environmental side, we're concerned with temperature, dissolved nutrients, including nitrate and others, water clarity, sediment grain size, hydrogen sulfide, and others. On the biological side, we're concerned about eelgrass wasting disease, as well as the complex and very interesting community dynamics in the eelgrass bed itself, the small inverts and algae that live in amongst the eelgrass that can have strong top-down effects on the health of eelgrass. And then on the anthropogenic side, we're interested in how vessel use, especially recreational boaters in sensitive eelgrass bays, may be at least correlated to patterns of eelgrass decline in particular areas. So as I've alluded to, our work is focused in the San Juan Islands for a couple reasons. First, this region has experienced some of the most significant eelgrass declines in the state. However, many of these sort of dramatically declining sites are right around the corner from sites that are doing quite well or even increasing. So this is great from an experimental sort of natural experiment perspective, is that we can access a gradient of eelgrass population trends sort of relatively easily from the logistical perspective. Another reason is that University of Washington's Friday Harbor Labs is on San Juan Island, and this is a great launching point for research, and has also been a nexus of eelgrass research for decades, especially pioneering work on eelgrass wasting disease. And then finally, a great benefit of working in the San Juans is that multiple organizations are already engaged in a variety of different eelgrass work. The San Juans has been working with DNR on multiple eelgrass projects. San Juan County has spearheaded vessel monitoring from the and how vessel use in sensitive eelgrass bays may be linked to eelgrass decline. And the San Juan County Conservation District is leading a separate HSIL-funded project focused on eelgrass restoration. So fieldwork is underway. There was a whole bunch of it just 2 weeks ago. And we'll be finishing up our fieldwork this summer. And we're planning to hold a workshop about a year from now at Friday Harbor Labs, wrapping up this work. And thanks to HSIL and our real amazing project team that's bringing all this work together. So thanks.
All right. Still down numbers with Gray from DNR.
Thanks, Bree. Hi, everyone. My name's Gray McKenna. You can use they, them pronouns for me, and I'm here today with my colleague Danielle Clare of the Nearshore Habitat Program at WDNR. And like Wendell, we're in the midst of this. So this is going to be a light walk through our current HSIL funded work, leveraging historical imagery to assess floating kelp canopy changes over 30 years in northeastern Puget Sound. All right, so I know folks in this room know that kelp forests are really important ecosystems for us here in Washington State. We have two forest-forming floating kelps. Nereus is the bull kelp and Macrocystis is the giant kelp. I'm mostly focusing on Nereus today, but when I say floating kelp, I want you to know what I'm talking about. These forests are ecologically and economically and culturally significant for human communities, for killer whales. Also, there was a really exciting recent discovery about killer whale usage of kelp for social behavior. And we can floating kelp forests. We want to know what's going on with them. And so there exists the floating kelp bed area indicator, part of the Puget Sound Partnerships themselves program, which reports on the status and trends of floating kelp forests throughout the state. You can scan a little QR code if you want to zoom around the map and see what's going on. And as you can see from the map, there are some areas that have experienced large declines in floating kelp forests. And one important aspect of the indicator is that it also helps us understand what we don't know about kelp and helps highlight where these data gaps are. Puget Sound is a region that's highlighted in yellow here on the map that we're zoomed into that stands out with as having very little kelp monitoring data. So we don't have a great historical or spatial sense of what is going on with floating kelp in that area. Which brings me to our current project, a new analysis of a historical data source. And that historical data source is cans of color infrared film that have been sitting on shelves at the Natural Resources Building for the last 30 years. And they represent a really excellent data source for floating kelp analysis because they're collected at summer in the low tides in the 90s. And here's some screenshots, like totally not color corrected or anything, where you can see the floating kelp in that historical aerial film in Whatcom and Skagit counties. So our project plan is to get started. We have to bring those cans of film into a modern GIS format. So that film has to be scanned and aerially triangulated and orthomosaic, etc. And as you can see from the map here on the right or left side of the screen, depending on if you're me or you. We've got that done already, thanks to our DNR photogrammetry folks who have helped us bring this imagery in. And so now we get to the fun part that involves me spending a lot of time in ArcGIS, which is analyzing kelp presence in the historical imagery. And this is what we are currently doing. I don't have time to get into the methods, but if you're a GIS nerd and you want to know about it, please find me. Essentially, I'm doing a lot of masking to remove land and deep water, and then myself and the computer are collaborating and figuring out which pixels are kelp and which are not. Once we have that historical imagery analyzed, we're going to be able to compare it to our modern digital aerial imagery. We have an imagery program that covers over 750,000 acres of the state. You can scan the QR code here to learn more about that. It represents a really excellent comparison set for our historical imagery. So we're going to use that to get a sense for how kelp is changing in the area. And so finally, we're going to be sharing out those results, integrating them in places like the indicator and hopefully elsewhere, with the goal of improving our understanding of if and how floating kelp has changed in this area over the last 30 years. We'll be producing a fun story map that you can zoom around through, a really detailed technical report with all the gory GIS details, and then we're going to be making all of the data, including the imagery, publicly available. And we have a coalition of a lot of folks who are meeting with us throughout the project, who are interested in working on kelp in this region so that we can make these products and results most useful for everyone who's interested in kelp in northeastern Puget Sound. And I will stop there. And here's our email, so you can reach out to us with questions. That's all.
How's this sound? Is this better? All right, we're moving up the watershed, and welcome to new folks coming in. This is Tara.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tara Newman. I am a senior planner with the Department of Commerce's Growth Management Services, where we help local governments with their land use planning under the Growth Management Act. So I feel like I'm kind of the odd one out in this session because I'm not going to be talking about kelp or eelgrass at all. But but I'm excited to share an update on our Puget Sound land use mapping project with you all today. We've made a lot of progress since last year's summit, and we have preliminary versions of some of our maps already ready for you all to explore. So I'll start with just a short overview of what the Puget Sound mapping project is and the kinds of maps that we're developing. I'll talk a little bit about how those maps can be used, and then I'll talk about our next steps to use those maps for policy analysis and to develop an integrated web mapping tool as a decision support tool for local and regional planning. So essentially what the Puget Sound Mapping Project boils down to is a map tool that shows growth patterns across the Puget Sound region using consistent methods across cities and counties. And one of the big challenges with regional land use planning is that there are 125 different jurisdictions in the Puget Sound region, and every city and county has its own zoning system and its own set of development regulations within those zones. So that makes it really difficult to map zones across jurisdictions, and that makes it difficult to get a picture of what's going on with land use at the region scale and at the state scale. So our map essentially translates each local jurisdiction's unique zoning designations into standardized land use categories. And then we also integrate housing data to compare expected and actual development patterns. So this is what our standardized land use map looks like, where we've assigned each local zone to a general land use category. And we also have a subcategory map that breaks that down into a lot more detail. And that allows us to compare land use patterns and trends across jurisdictions for the first time. And the map also integrates annual housing growth information from the Office of Financial Management Small Area Estimates program. So we can see how many new housing units were built each year and calculate a housing development intensity index. So that allows us to easily compare expected development patterns based on planned land use and zoning with the actual development patterns across the landscape. So some of the ways that those maps can be used is to look at the amounts of each land use type or the amount of housing development in certain areas like urban growth areas or natural resource areas or sensitive watersheds, and to analyze patterns of land use and housing growth to understand if our plans are working as intended or if there might be unintended consequences in some of these areas that are experiencing growth pressures. So our original Puget Sound land use maps were developed using 2012 zoning data, and obviously a lot has changed since then, so they've been very out of date for a while now. So we received National Estuary Program funding to update the maps and then use them to analyze land use trends over the past decade and develop an integrated web map to support local and regional planning. And right about the same time that we received our NEP funding for this project, we also received a proviso from the Washington State Legislature to develop a statewide zoning atlas. So that was something that we were not expecting, but the timeline aligned very well with this project. So we were able to integrate those two projects and add a lot of value that wouldn't have been possible with either project on its own. So we designed the Washington Zoning Atlas database to integrate the standardized land use categories that had already been developed for the Puget Sound Mapping Project. And the Zoning Atlas database also adds a lot of detail about the allowed uses for each zone and the development standards that are regulated by each zone. So that's information that we never had in our Puget Sound maps previously. And it also allowed us to expand the map statewide, which had never been possible with our Puget Sound funding focus in the past. So the Zoning Atlas project wrapped up this past summer. And so our preliminary standardized land use maps are already available through the Zoning Atlas on Commerce's website. So we have an interactive map where you can explore the data, and we also have a downloadable database. So if you open the Zoning Atlas Interactive map, it looks like this, and you can see the first map that comes up on the screen is our standardized land use map from the Puget Sound Mapping Project. So we have our general land use categories that classify each zone pretty broadly. And then we also have more specific land use subcategories that provide a lot more detail about the type and intensity of allowed uses in each zone. So those maps are very valuable, and they're something that most other states that have developed similar zoning atlases have not included. So our NEP funding currently and in the past has really added a ton of value to the statewide zoning atlas project as well. And then for each zone, the zoning atlas also adds additional information that we didn't have in the Puget Sound land use mapping project before. So for each zone, we track the allowed uses for that zone. So things like residential, office, commercial, industrial, and natural resource uses. So on this map, for example, you can see all of the areas where retail and dining uses are allowed. And we also tracked a set of density and dimensional attributes for each zone. So this map shows allowed building heights. We also have residential densities, minimum lot sizes, floor area ratios, which is the ratio of building size to lot size, the amount of each lot that can be covered by structures or impervious surfaces, how many housing units are allowed per lot, where you can build an accessory dwelling unit, where there might be bonuses or incentives related to affordable housing or transfer of development rights programs, some of the minimum parking requirements for different land uses, and a few layers that show where different types of development are allowed. So this one shows where you could build various heights of apartment buildings, and this one shows where you could build middle housing. So the zoning atlas has been very well received, and it's been already used in a variety of ways. It's great for analyzing statewide and regional trends, for assessing how zoning aligns with development and conservation goals, and for comparing zoning across jurisdictions and facilitating cross-jurisdictional planning. And it makes zoning information a lot more accessible, especially in some of the smaller jurisdictions that don't have good GIS capabilities. And then it also provides a way to start to identify and address some of the opportunities and barriers for development. So again, the extra funding that we got for the zoning atlas was a great benefit for this project in terms of being able to collect a lot of that additional information. And our NEP program funding allowed us to integrate those standardized land use maps into the zoning atlas, which is a really important part of many of those uses that I just mentioned. So that preliminary zoning data is available and ready for you all to explore as part of the zoning atlas. And with our National Estuary Program funding, we're currently working on next steps to make that information even more useful for the Puget Sound region. So one thing that we're working on is standardizing things that are really inconsistently addressed in local zoning maps. So for example, some jurisdictions cut right-of-ways out of their zones and others don't, and same with things like water bodies and tribal and federal lands. So we've been using supplemental data layers for those kinds of features to more consistently show those on our land use maps and make sure that they're not being counted as part of local zones, because that can really mess up analysis, especially if you're calculating acreages and trying to compare those numbers between jurisdictions. And then, so we're almost done with that process and cleaning up those maps. And then the next step that we'll be working on is to work with the OFM to add their housing growth information. And that again is information that we use as a way to compare planned land use in the form of zoning with actual development measured in terms of housing growth. So kind of the difference between what's allowed versus what actually gets built. So then once those maps are completed and published, which we are expecting to happen later this spring, we are moving on to work on a growth trends analysis, which I'm really excited about. So we'll be able to compare our new maps with the originals from more than a decade ago and be able to dive into some analysis questions about where zoning changes have taken place and whether those changes are consistent with growth management goals. So we'll also be able to see if changes in observed density have been consistent with zoning changes and which areas are seeing higher low levels of growth. And we'll be able to combine that information with other maps to assess where growth is occurring compared to where we really want to be seeing growth and development happening around the sound. So that might include maps that show things like critical areas, natural resource lands, priority watersheds, climate risks, environmental justice indicators, transit options, and other community services. And so that analysis will give us a good picture of what land use changes have been happening across the region and whether densities are actually increasing in the most appropriate areas. And then the last piece of the project will be developing an integrated web map for people to explore land use in the Puget Sound region. So that web map will display our original and updated Puget Sound land use mapping project layers. And we're hoping to also pull in some of the other resource agency maps that we would like local planners to consider when they're making their land use decisions. So that might include maps that show recovery priorities related to habitat, watershed function, climate change, critical areas, cultural resources, and other factors. And they'll be able to overlay those with our land use maps to see how their land use plans and development patterns align with recovery priorities and ecosystem needs. So thank you all for your time today. We'll be looking for input on our analysis and our web map in the coming months. So if you have any interest in participating or providing input on anything that we should include, please feel free to reach out to me anytime. Thank you.
We have some time for one or two questions. You did great. Is there any questions out there? Yes, Ian.
So the question is for the growth trends analysis, how we are measuring growth. So essentially there's two pieces to that we're mapping. So one is zoning. So one is looking at upzoning and where local governments are increasing the allowed densities. And the other piece is annual housing growth. So we have data on how many housing units are constructed each year down to the census block level. So pretty fine scale data on where housing growth is occurring. So we'll be looking at growth in terms of that. And we had originally looked at using all permit data back when we first did this, but there were a lot of complications with that. So we're just using housing growth as a proxy. Yes. So the question is if the underlying GIS data for our map are publicly available. And yes, they will be. So the pieces that are published as part of the zoning atlas are already publicly available through the Washington State Open Data Portal. So you can just search zoning atlas on there and it should come right up. And our original Puget Sound mapping project layers are also available, but those are of course outdated now. But we should have new ones posted in the next few months. I would like to, but that's a big project. I know Department of Fish and Wildlife has done some work trying to map critical areas ordinances, and there have been a lot of challenges with that. It's not something that we have taken on at Commerce at this point, but maybe in the future, it would be great to get better critical areas maps first as well. Okay. Thank you.
All right, up next. There you are. Oh, no.
That's okay.
Okay.
It just is missing the. It's okay. All right. Hi, I'm Simone DeRoche. I'm at Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'm in Habitat Program as a research scientist. And I'm going to be talking really quickly because there's a lot to show in this talk here. So today I'm talking to you about our HSIL funded project that explores how ponds constructed for urban stormwater management can simultaneously act as habitat for native and invasive species. Oops. Oh, shouldn't touch that. Okay. Go back. Okay, this one is ahead because it's the bigger button. Okay, my my team includes Jessica Sandoval, who's a WDFW fish and wildlife biologist. She is really the powerhouse behind this project. She's the one who leads the field team and collects all the data. And we also partner with over 10 city and county jurisdictions through this project, as well as Woodland Park Zoo, Wenatchee Valley College, and WSU. And I want to mention that this project was initiated by Max Lambert, who's now at the Nature Conservancy, and he passed this project on to me about 2 or 3 years ago, 2 years ago. Okay, so many of us know that Western Washington has lost a substantial amount of its wetlands, up to a third, and since the 1790s and substantial urban development. So shown here is a old topographic map of the Seattle area from 1897. And if we zoom in here, I love these old maps. We can see in the red boxed areas extensive wetlands mapped. And so all these areas have really been converted to impervious surface, a lot of development and that sort of thing. And wetlands had and have a really important function in Western Washington because we receive up to 60 inches of rainfall per year. And with increasing urban development and impervious surfaces and the loss of these wetlands, really this rainwater has nowhere to go. And so basically the main solution has been for cities and other jurisdictions to create what are called stormwater ponds. And these have been a really important part of Western Washington's urban infrastructure. These ponds are primarily constructed, managed, and maintained to slow water off impervious surfaces, to mitigate flooding, and to filter toxics out of runoff. So these ponds differ in construction, and this reflects primarily their function. We have kind of two ends of the spectrum. We have ponds that are detention ponds that are designed to dry down completely. And we have retention ponds that keep water in them year round. And like I said, these are kind of two ends of a spectrum. You get everything in between, and they're kind of not mutually exclusive. They're overlapping. So they also differ a lot in their habitat. We have these kind of dismal looking stormwater ponds that are concrete walled. Doesn't look like great habitat, but there's, I think, a merganser sitting there. And we have ponds that are a little bit more naturalized, and these have even native species planted. And these can even be blue-green infrastructure for local communities. So they can be stormwater parks, for example. So as an urban ecologist, what I find fascinating about these ponds is that in the absence of natural wetlands, they've attracted myriad wildlife, both native and, as I said, invasive species. So that leads us to the central question of this project, which is which stormwater pond attributes make them good habitat for these species? So we surveyed ponds across 6 counties across Puget Sound, and we selected ponds to have an equal distribution of major categories of land cover. So urban versus trees versus shrubs and herbaceous. So on the left, we have our total pool of stormwater ponds. This is about 6,000. And then on the right is our selected study ponds. So that's about 200. So we focus on biodiversity in many different species in this project. We do bird surveys with audio loggers and point counts. We record beaver signs and signals. We do fish trapping. But what we primarily focus on is amphibians, and we do egg mass surveys and trapping. And I'm going to be focusing on these data for the rest of the talk because these are the species that actually breed in the ponds, and we love our amphibians. Okay, so I'm going to focus on 5 different native species of amphibians. These are the northwest salamander, the northern red-legged frog, the long-toed salamander, the Pacific horse frog, and the rough-skinned newt. And all of these breed in our urban stormwater ponds. And one especially really cool thing that we see in this northwestern salamander is we commonly see the pedomorphic form. And you might think these look a lot like axolotls, which are super in vogue right now. But these are similar to axolotls in that they are pedomorphic. They retain their larval characteristics into adulthood. But these guys are facultatively or optionally pedomorphic, so they can retain their larval or aquatic characteristics kind of depending on their environment. So if the aquatic habitat is really, really awesome, cool water, deep water, and maybe if the terrestrial environment is a little more inhospitable, such as the case in urban habitats, we often see the pedomorphic form. And so this correlation we might be exploring a little bit further. Okay, so what's a little bit less cool is that we also see a lot of invasive species and other attributes of these ponds that make them more challenging for the native species. So for this reason, a lot of our partners are concerned that these ponds are attracting our native species and act as kind of ecological traps. They're exposing them to diseases and toxics and also invasive species. And one of the primary invasive species we're concerned about here is the American bullfrog. So these are introduced species. They're from the East Coast or Eastern North America originally. And importantly, they're voracious predators on our native species of amphibians, all different sorts of species, also small fishes as well. And importantly, also, they're characterized or classified rather as an aquatic invasive species. So to better understand the challenges associated with living in these stormwater ponds and to look at the attributes that were associated with presence of native species, we surveyed amphibians across 2 years, 2024 and 2025. We did 3 amphibian surveys per year, and by this I mean Jessica. We did 8 mass surveys in the early spring and then 2 rounds of trapping in the spring and summer. We also recorded general pond attributes, such as water quality. We looked at pond dimensions, surface area and depth, and we estimated vegetation cover. We also did a land cover estimation of 100 meters from the pond using GIS. And I'm not sure what happened to this slide here. That white thing is supposed to be the whole thing, but oh well. I'm not going to be talking about these data too much, but basically we looked at all these attributes, and this is as they affected our 5 native species of amphibians. This is presence and absence, so presence of these species as associated with these attributes, and bullfrogs as well. I don't have time to go through all of these attributes right now. So what I'm going to be focusing on is one of the most important characteristics of pond design, which is their relative size and whether they were going dry or not. So we've got small to mid-sized dry ponds, small to mid-size always wet ponds, and extra large size ponds that were always wet. And so what we see here is basically a kind of division of the species into 2 groups. We've got our smaller sized amphibians that are okay in those dry ponds, and we've got the larger sized amphibians, including the bullfrogs and the pedomorphic northwestern salamanders that really like those deeper ponds. And these preferences really make sense given the ecology of these species. The long-toed salamanders and the chorus frogs, they breed really quickly. They can get in and out. They also develop really quickly. Whereas, as I said, the bullfrogs and the northwestern salamanders, they have overwintering larvae. So they really need those ponds to be wet year-round. And again, with this funny white bar. Oh, well. So this is basically showing the coexistence of these species in different ponds. So we might expect that those species that preferred the same types of habitat to be co-occurring together. And to a certain extent, this is true. On the bottom there, we see high co-occurrence, so really dark blue or bluish green, I guess, between the long-toed salamanders and the chorus frogs. So that's not surprising. They prefer similar habitats. And then for bullfrogs, we see a strong negative co-occurrence with those 3 species. So again, not surprising, they prefer different habitats, and they also might be predators of those bite-sized amphibians. But what I find really interesting here is that we actually see a lack of co-occurrence, negative or positive, between the northwestern salamanders and the bullfrogs. And so this makes me really curious as an ecologist, like what's going on here? So we know that bullfrogs predate on northwestern salamanders, but we also know that northwestern salamanders can predate on tadpoles of bullfrogs. This is the most amazing video ever. I'll just show it again, even though I don't have that much time. Oh, I can't show it again. Oh, well, you can, this is from Jessica. It's a great figure, a great video. So this is a really interesting pattern. We can see ponds that are adjacent to one another, and one is full of bullfrogs and one is full of northwestern salamanders. And if we start to look at the abundance of these species, instead of just presence and absence, so I've got mean number of bullfrogs per trap on the y-axis, and then number of juveniles per trap and pedomorphs on the x-axis there. We see that basically if we get more than about 5 pedomorphic northwestern salamanders per trap, we're not seeing bullfrogs anymore, which is so cool. And what's extra cool here is that that's not the case for just catching juveniles. So awesome. Could it be that northwestern salamanders are acting as a in priority, showing priority effects over bullfrogs? Are they excluding them in some way? So again, something cool that we want to pursue. So invasive species management is just one of the potential ecosystem services we see amphibians providing in these urban stormwater ponds. Not only can they control potentially invasive species, but also pests like mosquitoes. They have strong roles in nutrient cycling, and they can act as bioindicators. And this is true for, you know, all sorts of ecosystems. And this last point, these amphibians as bioindicators, has really spurred the next phase of our project. And this is a partnership with Department of Ecology, WSU Vancouver, and us. And we're, sorry, and we are here looking at bullfrogs and Pacific chorus frogs and looking at how they are affected by that tire rubber chemical 6-PBDQ, both in the field and lab settings. And so this project is funded by the Stormwater Strategic Initiative Lead, and we're going to be doing the field work for it this year. Okay, so I'm almost done. I just want to do a shout out to our partners at Kitsap County and Woodland Park Zoo, who coordinate volunteer surveys to do egg mass surveys. And then also we are funding a master's student at WSU Puyallup who's looking at environmental health disparity and as that correlates to pond biodiversity. And with that, I'll thank you so much. Oh, I have time for a question. Yes. Any questions? I know it's really fast. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, of course. That is not my project, but I can, sure. What would you like? What would you like to know about it? Mm-hmm. I think here we're looking at basically a connection that is indirect. So we have a connection from something like environmental health disparity that might be correlated with something like tree cover or presence of stormwater parks, the more naturalized ponds, the funds that are available to make a pond more naturalized, and that associated with biodiversity. So as I said before, we were clustering our ponds into 3 different types of land covers. And so I would imagine that what we're looking at is kind of that indirect, kind of stepwise relationship. So from environmental health disparity to some sort of attribute of habitat, urban habitat like tree cover, and then to what can actually get to those ponds. And this could also be true for connectivity as well. Like more park area means that you might have more avenues for those amphibians to get to those stormwater ponds. So that's kind of the connection that she's exploring here. Oh, they said one question. One more question. Oh, sorry. Hopefully that was clear to those people online. Yes. So the question was whether different jurisdictions are basically optimizing or managing their ponds differently. And yes, it means that we have kind of this extra factor in our analysis, because some ponds, as you could see when I showed this stuff at the beginning, we basically have some ponds in Snohomish County, for example, that are all these like, pretty dismal looking concrete walled ponds. And then on the other hand, in some of the newer development areas, also in Snohomish County, but often in Kitsap, we see these more naturalized ponds. And those are going to be huge differences, right? And so we can't not include county as kind of a fact. I mean, this is a science answer, but county as a factor in our analysis. And I will say one other thing, which is the counties have different buy-in for how interested they are in whether these ponds are habitat or not. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Again, thank you. All right. We are moving back down to the water. Whoops. Okay. Yeah. Okay. One more. All right. And we have Aiden with Washington Department of Natural Resources.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Yes, my name is Aiden Cox, and I work with the Nearshore Habitat Program at Washington Department of Natural Resources. And today I'm going to give you a lightning quick review of some of the main takeaways from our HSIL funded project, which is all about identifying the factors that are associated with floating kelp resilience and loss in the Salish Sea. And before we dive in, I just want to take a moment to briefly introduce you to our primary study species. And that is this guy, the bull kelp, Nereus lutekiana. And like all species of kelps, this is a large brown marine algae. And across most of our state, it's the only species of kelp that forms a floating canopy at the water surface. To illustrate how important that is, I like to show this photo of what healthy bull kelp forest looks like from beneath the water surface. Just like trees in a terrestrial forest, bull kelp acts as a marine foundation species, which means in this case that it provides food and shelter for a diversity of other marine life. This includes everything from tiny invertebrates to forage fish like you can see here, all the way up to salmon, rockfish. Even humans have depended on the diversity of life in kelp forests since time immemorial. Now, historically, bull kelp has really thrived in the cold and nutrient-rich waters along the Pacific coast of North America, stretching from Point Conception in Southern California all the way north to Alaska. But in recent years, there have been dramatic declines in bull kelp in regions such as Northern California and Oregon, which have lost more than 2/3 of their historic kelp due to stressors like grazing from purple sea urchins and marine heat waves. Here in Washington state, data from a variety of monitoring programs suggests that our kelp forests are relatively stable along Washington's outer coast and in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which are shown here in blue. But there are substantial declines occurring in other regions like South and Central Puget Sound, which are shown in red here. Now, as we heard from my colleague Gray McKenna earlier, the declines may be more widespread than this because there are still some regions where we really lack enough monitoring data to draw firm conclusions. But based on the data we do have, the story is a little more complex than what I've just presented to you, because even in regions of decline on this map shown in red, there are pockets where bull kelp appears to be resilient, and those are shown by the tiny blue circles. And really importantly, we don't have a firm grasp of what's causing this variability in kelp decline. And so our HSIL funded project sought to advance our understanding of one central question. And that's what is driving these patterns of kelp resilience and loss across Washington state. To address this question, our team which is highly collaborative, just like all the presentations shown today, we tackled 3 key knowledge gaps. First, we wanted to know what biotic communities are associated with kelp resilience and decline. To address this, we partnered with scuba divers from the University of Washington to conduct underwater surveys of the marine life present in kelp forests. Next, we wanted to know what environmental conditions are associated with decline. And so we asked the same divers to help us deploy some continuous temperature and light sensors. And we also conducted some monthly water quality sampling at kelp forests across the state. And finally, we wanted to know what patterns of morphology and physiology or performance were associated with kelp forests across the state. So we physically went out and measured the kelp where it was still present and partnered with researchers from the University of Chicago to do some advanced studies on kelp's performance and photosynthesis. And we did all of this work at a network of 15 sites of current and historic kelp beds with a diversity of current trends in kelp bed area, including sites that are stable, shown here in green, and sites that are either declining or where bull kelp has been completely lost, and those are shown in red. And now that you're primed with the background, let's start by considering some of the things we found in the biotic communities. So here I'm showing you a list of the 14 invertebrate species that divers identified during their surveys. Species with blue boxes were more abundant in areas of dense kelp, and those with yellow boxes were more abundant in areas of sparse or absent kelp. And the asterisks mark correlations that are statistically significant. And one of our key findings was that there were very few significant correlations between invertebrates and bull kelp density, which suggests that a lot of the relationships our divers were seeing could have been caused by random chance. This includes the purple sea urchin, which is responsible for kelp declines in other regions. Sea urchins were generally pretty rare during our dive surveys, and all 3 species present in our region were more abundant in areas of dense kelp, which really suggests that urchins are not associated with kelp decline in our study area, at least not in the same ways in Oregon and California. Our dive teams also surveyed 10 other species of marine algae and found that the only significant correlations with bull kelp were positive, suggesting that environmental conditions that are good for bull kelp are likely to promote the growth of other species of marine algae. Next, we wanted to consider what some of those environmental conditions might be. And so we surveyed 13 environmental variables, which are hypothesized to be kelp stressors based on previous research in other regions. And in our study, we found that only 4 of these were significantly different between sites of stable and declining bull kelp. These were water temperature, measured both at the sea floor and sea surface, nitrate concentrations, and seawater salinity. Next, I'm going to show you exactly how these variables differed between sites of stable and declining bull kelp. And I'm going to use a series of graphs that will have time along the x-axis and one of our environmental variables along the y-axis. In this case, it's the daily maximum benthic temperature, that's seafloor temperatures, recorded by our underwater sensors. We found that declining sites were associated with significantly warmer water temperatures, and this pattern was true both at the seafloor and sea surface, so I'm only going to show you seafloor temperatures here. And importantly, this difference in temperature was greatest during the summer months between July and September. That really stood out. Similarly, we observed that declining sites were associated with significantly lower nitrate concentrations. And this is important because nitrate is one of the critical nutrients supporting kelp growth, and it's often limiting in our study system. Just like with temperature, we found that this difference was not consistent over the course of the year, but declining sites really showed less nitrate concentrations during the period of April through October. And finally, we found that declining sites were associated with significantly lower salinity seawater, and this difference was relatively consistent over the course of the year. Now, importantly, we observed that water temperature, nitrate concentration, and salinity also followed a large-scale gradient across our study area. Here I'm showing you box plots for each of those environmental variables with sites arranged along the x-axis according to their distance from the ocean. We found that sites far from the ocean, which are shown here in red, were associated with the same conditions as declining sites, namely warmer water temperatures, lower nitrate concentrations, and lower salinities. Now, there were some exceptions to this pattern. For example, here I'm showing you highlighting the conditions at Salmon Beach, which is one of the last remaining kelp beds in South Puget Sound. And we observed that conditions here were more similar to sites near the ocean than we would have expected given Salmon Beach's inland conditions or inland location. But overall, we kind of firmly concluded that declining sites are strongly associated with inland conditions. Next, we wanted to consider what these conditions might be, or how these conditions might be affecting the growth of bull kelp. And we found that inland sites were associated with unique patterns of performance and morphology. Here I'm showing you really similar box plots to the last slide, except now the y-axis is showing the percentage of nitrogen present in kelp blades across our sites, with the same order along the x-axis, except there are two new comparison sites shown in pink and gray, which are sites pretty close to the outer coast. We found that kelps growing in inland sites where nitrogen was more scarce incorporated less nitrogen into their tissues, which represents less material that's available to support growth and tissue repair. Again, Salmon Beach stood out a bit as a bit of an exception, though, with more nitrate or nitrogen in its tissue than we would have expected given its location. We also measured the size of bull kelp and found that kelp growing in inland locations tended to be physically smaller. Here I'm showing you values of subbulb diameter, which is a part of the kelp that's a good proxy for its overall size and mass. And you can see that sites growing in the inland waters on the right-hand side tended to be physically smaller. We also found that kelps growing in inland sites tended to have fewer blades, and those blades tended to be physically smaller or shorter. And this is important because not only are the blades where kelp is photosynthesizing, they're where kelp's reproductive spores are produced. So kelp with fewer, smaller blades might have diminished reproductive output. And lastly, I want to highlight that again, Salmon Beach stood out as an exception with relatively large blades, and those blades tended to be more numerous and longer than at other inland sites, which really highlights that there's something unique going on at this site, and the kelp is doing really well there. And I know that was a lot of information really fast, so I want to take my last minute to just kind of highlight some of the main conclusions. First, we found that biotic communities were really similar between sites of stable and declining bull kelp, and that sea urchins do not appear to be associated with kelp decline in our study area. We found that declining sites are strongly associated with inland conditions, such as warm water temperatures, low nitrate concentrations, and low seawater salinities. And we also found that kelp growing in these inland locations were generally smaller with lower nitrogen reserves, demonstrating poorer condition. However, there were some important exceptions to this pattern, like Salmon Beach, which may be an important kelp refuge within Puget Sound. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. If you're curious to learn more, please stay tuned for our team's final research report on this work, which should be coming out in July of this year. And yeah, thanks again. Okay, yeah. Sure. I think we have some time for questions if there are any. Yeah, Zach. Mm. Right. Great question. So just to repeat it for folks online, the question was, have we considered wastewater outflows associated with nitrogen inputs into the system as possibly being a cause of kelp resilience in some areas? And that has not been a direct facet of our study, but we have observed that areas with kind of nitrogen additions in the summertime are sometimes associated with kelp resilience. In the case of Salmon Beach, that happens naturally because of the narrow tidal channel and shallow bathymetric sill, which kind of promotes strong mixing that brings nutrients and nitrogen up from the deep waters. At other sites like Edmonds, which is just south of the Snohomish River mouth and Mukilteo, we think that weaker stratification there during the summer might allow nutrients to kind of naturally mix as well. So yes, I think that's a natural follow-up question to this work, is kind of considering where nitrogen additions might be promoting bull kelp. But it's also a complicated question, right? Because additions of nitrate could be associated with kind of detrimental consequences to kelp health if they occur at the wrong time of the year and promote growth of other primary producers like harmful algae. Yeah, great question. Thanks. Yeah, in the back. Yes, I'm so glad you asked this question. So to repeat it again for folks online is, did we see any association between kelp crabs and kelp decline? And this is a key kind of limitation of our studies because our divers were surveying underwater transects. They weren't often looking up at the kelp canopies, which is where kelp crabs really like to hang out. Some of our other surveys, like when we were measuring the kelp, happened as part of DNR's long-term kayak monitoring programs. And those surveys are at the canopy taking place during summer. And we anecdotally observed massive quantities of kelp crabs at some of our sites in South Puget Sound. So this is another kind of really important area for follow-up work, is we need to understand more about, where kelp crabs are in our system, how those abundances are changing over time, and if they're going to move now that kelp is disappearing in South Puget Sound. So great question. That's future work.
One last round of applause.
Yeah.
All right. Many thanks to the speakers for being incredibly timely. Really appreciate that. We are about ready to wrap up this session. And I do want to, before we head out, want to give you a couple reminders about how lunch is going to run. Lunch is back down in the grand hall. And in that back part of the room, there's a room, there will be food laid out. And on the sides of that room are those are food for those who have dietary restrictions. So if you do not have a dietary restriction, please use the tables in the center of that room with the food laid out, so we make sure that there is plenty of food for those that have those restrictions. Also, if you are presenting in an afternoon session, please arrive at your assigned room at 1:20 so we can go through a little tech check and get you oriented. Those sessions, as just a reminder, we have lunch until 1:30 though, so it's a nice robust lunch. So hopefully you'll have a lot of time to connect and eat and chat. And again, see your program for what those session topics are in the afternoon. We will have one final panel at the very end of the day before wrapping up, just before 3. I see that I know we had some really rapid presentations early on in the beginning. If there was any burning questions to the folks who are doing the lightning talks, we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions from earlier, if there are any. Otherwise, we can get to the front of the lunch line. All right. Well, let's give one big last round of applause for all of our speakers. Thank you so much.